So we're about 20 seconds from starting. If anybody would like to testify, please sign in. The sign-in sheets are over on the table, and so we will begin here shortly.
Some people that hide out in Glenwood.
It's up to you. So the notice says that you may allow testimony if you choose to. If there's technical difficulties, then the hearing goes on as scheduled, though.
Well, yeah, I just told the commissioner, the chairman, I won't be here next month. I'll be in Los Angeles. Sorry about that.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the meeting, and there'll be some time during the consent if people still want to sign in and during the testimony as well. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. This is the City of Garden City Planning and Zoning Commission meeting for today, Wednesday, September 18th, 2024. Let the record show that it is 6:31. Ms. Veal, confirming audio and video is working?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'll now call the meeting to order. For the record, we'll show that we have Commissioners Smith, Wild, Brown, and Shepherd present. So we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, so this commission provides for a public hearing for quasi-judicial administrative land use decisions, appeals, and legislative actions specific to land use regulations. The format for the public hearing will follow the following procedures for each application: presentation by the applicant, presentation by city staff, public testimony, rebuttal testimony from the applicant, discussion of hearing among the commissioner members, and then a decision. If the public wishes to give testimony, there are some general rules to abide by. No person shall be permitted to speak at the public hearing until the person is recognized by the chairperson to do so. The commission will not address those who speak out of order. If you have questions, you may ask them during your turn for public testimony, and then the applicant can respond to them during the rebuttal. The commission will also have questions that they can pose to staff as well as the applicant. The sign-up sheets, again, are on the table. Please sign up. If you wish to give public testimony, no person shall be permitted to testify at the public hearing unless such person has signed their full name and written their residential address on the sign-up sheet. When you approach the podium, please state your name and address for the record. So Ms. Veal, are there any changes to the agenda tonight?
No, Mr. Chairman, there are not.
All right, thank you. So we will move into the consent agenda. So with the consent agenda, from time to time, there are items that do not require separate discussion. We may move the items to the consent agenda if there's no discussion. Following the addition of any items to the consent agenda, we will vote on the remaining items in one motion. At this time, I do see that there is one item that could potentially be moved to the consent agenda. That is SUB FY 2024-0005, Zana Place Townhomes. So with this, is the applicant present?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. Have you read the decision document?
Yes, we have.
And are you in agreement to the conditions that are set forth in the decision document?
Yes.
Okay. Is there anybody from the public that's here to testify on that matter? Anybody from Zoom that's here to testify on that matter? This is, again, SUB FY 2024-005, Zana Place Townhomes. All right, seeing no one from the public here to testify, staff, is there any reason that we should not move this to the consent, or any comments or questions that you would like discussion at the commission?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Commissioners, any reason that you have that we should not move this item to the consent agenda? No. All right. With that, we can have a motion when the time comes for moving that item to the consent agenda. On the consent agenda, we have item A, which is approval of the minutes from the August 21st, 2024 meeting. Any discussion on the consent agenda?
Mr. Chair.
Hearing none, I will entertain a motion.
Mr. Chair,
Commissioner Wild,
I will move approval of the consent agenda to consist of the approval of minutes from the August 21, 2024 meeting. We'll also ask for consent agenda approval of SUB 2024-0005 Zana Place Townhomes.
thank you, Commissioner Wild. We have a motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Have a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, we can put this to vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Are there any noes? The ayes have it. All right, that will take care of the consent agenda. Thank you, sir. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
All right, on to the new business, item number 6, public hearing action items. The first item A we have is DSR FY 2024-0013, design review processed as a planned unit development. We will hear from Mr. Hatch. Again, just as a procedural matter, we will have a brief introduction. We'll have presentation by the applicant. We're going to limit you to 15 minutes. We'll have the city staff report, public hearing. They'll be limited to 3 minutes per person. And we will allow for rebuttal testimony from the applicant. We'll close the public hearing and then discuss the hearing among the commissioner members. And then we will have a decision. So at this time, we will move to the applicant. Just real quick, Jeff, before you start, is there any other submittals for public testimony that we have? Jenna?
Chairman, it appears that there will be some coming that I will bring to you shortly.
Okay, sounds good. And then we will tonight allow for public testimony from anybody that's on Zoom. However, if there is an issue, then the meeting will go on without your testimony. So we will have the public testimony for those that are here public first, and then we can move over to the Zoom participants thereafter. So, Mr. Hatch. Do I need to share?
Good evening, Jeff Hatch with Hatch Design Architecture. Our address is 200 West 36th Street in Garden City, 83714. Thank you, Chairman Montoya and Commissioners, for your consideration of our planned unit development application this evening. The subject property is located on 42nd Street, just south of the Fisher's office building, which is adjacent to the river. And we also have some frontage that is along Veterans Memorial Parkway, although that parkway is elevated above our site substantially, so we would not be taking access off of that. To the west, we have the Boys and Girls Club. To the south, we have some townhomes and a series of apartment complexes. And then across Veterans, we also have some condos and apartment complexes with the boardwalk development as well. The proposed structure would be located directly south of the existing Fishers Technology Building. And we would be taking our primary access off of the existing frontage on the cul-de-sac, and that would be a shared access with Fishers, and then would circulate around the facility, discharging back on 42nd Street. With our dialogue with the design review committee, one of the concerns was parking this facility and being able to provide optimal flexibility for our intended uses now and in the future. And so in working with city staff, we were able to look at the existing parking and uses for the Fishers facility as well as our proposed facility. And we'd be proposing uses in the C2 zone appropriate for a low to medium intensity parking, which we can park on site and meet that per code. Some of the amenities that we have on the facility, on the rooftop, we have a rooftop deck space with a conference area, a clubhouse, and this, the intended use of that would be, anything from more of kind of business events, corporate meetings, and office functions for the Fishers facility. And one of the main considerations with this site in general is we're nestled up next to the river. And so you have a semi-industrial office building with warehouse that's currently adjacent to the river, and somewhere down the road we'll have a greater and better use intended for that facility. And so looking ahead, really what the intent with this facility is to serve the needs of the Fishers in the community, Fishers office in the community today, and be able to look to the future to convert and in theory move the Fishers office as need be to this facility for a greater and better use for that river frontage property. And so as part of that, we had to look at using the facility for their current proposed use, which is self-storage, and then how that would convert into office space in the future. And so conceptualizing the facades, the elevations, the egress, the stairs, the elevators in a way that's adaptable for these uses and the needs for the parking within that facility was a study that we had to do. And with that, we did a little bit of a case study around Idaho as well as other areas. And we have some, I guess, considerations of, majority of the time when we do new construction, we do new construction based on a single use. And if you're doing storage, to be able to adapt a single level storage facility into something else is almost impossible. And so that really leads us to, if we're adding on an addition to an existing structure to make something work, which would be an appendage, or are we converting a facility? And so really when we were looking at the most economical way to go about this, we were looking at the strategy of how to convert a single form into multiple different uses. A nice local case study would be the Statesman building, which was used as an office building for the Idaho Statesman for decades, and then recently was converted into conditioned self-storage. So with that, there's a range of criteria with the PUD that we wanted to recap. We feel that we can provide this development within the timeline allotted with that PUD. We feel that the structure can exist independently of the surrounding, but is still a benefited effect, and the use of this area is appropriate. Storage is an essential use for the surrounding high density housing, and ability to expand office in the potential future has potential to create employment in the surrounding area. The storage has a low impact use for traffic, which was one of the concerns from the neighbors as well. as the surrounding area develops. And the site is adequate for drive lanes and parking. The proposed commercial development can be justified at its location, which we feel that the site is zoned for commercial development and the city services can support the proposed project. The application meets the provisions of the plan unit development, and the development provides a low impact use with no significant increase in traffic for congestion. The storage is an essential use for the surrounding high density housing and the ability to expand that office and surrounding area. Now, in particular, the comprehensive plan is something that's looked at with PUD as well. And so we broke out goals 1, 2, 4, 10, and 12, which we feel this project exemplifies. And as you're going from Boise back into Garden City over the bridge and looking at this facility, we wanted something that has an opportunity for public art, for murals, for things that can adapt over time based on those uses and be a nice eye-catching moment for people as they traverse Veterans Memorial Parkway. We did have some public comments that I also wanted to speak to. The vast majority of concerns from the neighbors was traffic, and the storage use is about the least traffic generating use that we could provide for this area. But with that, we do have parking sufficient for a higher traffic use, which in that future time may require a traffic study just to be able to justify those uses. The storage use is compatible with high density housing, and we see this in a range of different areas with these adaptive use projects. Pedestrian engagement, the storage office has been moved to engage 42nd, and so we've actually relocated the entrance to 42nd for pedestrian access. And that was something suggested from design review with their approval. The bike rack and benches were also added to the entrance to engage the public. And its adjacency to most of the apartments in this area also makes it very convenient for pedestrian foot traffic. Any above ground utility lines, the applicant agrees that utilities located on the property should be moved underground. There's a range of utilities in these areas, and neighbors had concerns about if it was going to stay like that forever, or with this development, would those improvements take place? And then as far as fit and location, the building's creative design will welcome the public into the city along Veterans Memorial Parkway. A public art feature along the facade will further enhance the city's goals for promoting public art and inspiring creativity. And I will stand for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hatch. Any questions for the applicant?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Brown?
Mr. Hatch, you're getting to be a regular here.
Well, it's an honor.
Well, thank you. I do have a question. I presume that you read the draft requirements that would be placed in the event that we made a recommendation to forward this to with approval. Is that correct? Am I assume that?
Commissioner Brown, you are correct.
I would like for you to comment on what the impact is and how you see handling it. The fact that under the site-specific requirements, this self-service facility that self-service storage part of it will be limited severely to 11,419 square feet. Would you comment on that, please?
Commissioner Brown, the current allowed square footage for the property is the declared amount that you've indicated. Part of our request this evening would be some leniency if the commission so chooses on that square footage. And so we would ideally be proposing the upper floors at this time to be utilized as self-storage. And then in the future, as the need for office becomes more prevalent, we would transition that back to an office use.
So you're going to be, as part of this, then you're requesting that we in some guise make it so that requirement in the short term, at least until sometime on the dated time in the future, that be relaxed. Is that correct?
Commissioner Brown, in many plan unit developments, I was here a couple weeks back. In that case, we were looking at both density and square footage for some leniency. And so in this case, we're looking at a leniency in the percentage would essentially be what we're requesting.
I can't, would you have a suggestion about how much relaxation, like how much of a percentage? That's a percentage limitation. I think I read in there, it's 10%. Is that correct?
Correct.
Gets that. What would you suggest that we would want to consider for a relaxation?
Currently, based on our mathematic tabulations based on code, we would be requesting 68%.
That's the only question I have. Thank you.
Any other questions for the applicant from the commissioners? So I have some questions for you, Mr. Hatch. So we have 3 submittals from you. The first one being a full facility that has storage, and then different iterations, and then the resubmittal as of 9/18 shows code compliance on the 11,000 square feet. So your application is for, on the resubmittal, is for 11,000 square feet of storage in a 90,000 square foot building. Is that correct? Or are you saying that the application is actually for the full facility based on your initial application to be storage?
Chairman Montoya, our intent was to provide design review, an application that they can review and approve based on their feedback. And so the revisions to the exterior facade, the recesses, the adjustments to the awnings, things of that nature were conveyed and presented to design review for their review and approval. As far as the intended use and request for increase, that was something that was conveyed as something that would be discussed with planning and zoning. And that would be our intent, would be to proceed with the intentions of the application as presented, with the request for consideration for that increased square footage or percentage. But the intent is that we're looking at a facility that in the future can be used and parked on site without any exceptions for office. But in the meantime, we would request some consideration for leniency for self-storage.
Okay, and the reason why I'm asking is because the code specifically states that all uses that are allowed within the land use district, so this is C2, are permitted within a PUD. So storage not being permitted. However, you can allow up to 10% of the gross land area for the other uses that are not allowed upon other conditions of approval. So it's C2, you're not allowed to have, or you're not permitted within that district to have storage. In a PUD, you're allowed up to 10% of the gross land area. So if we say 10%, all you're going to get, what's the plan after that?
Well, then we'd go back to Fishers and discuss if they're comfortable with that, or if we would want to go do a rezone to more appropriately set that. But the intent and being heard today was to have the dialogue as far as the need that we're seeing and hearing from the general public, and requesting an increase for leniency on that percentage.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for the applicant? All right, thank you, Mr. Hatch.
Thank you.
Ms. Beal.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. This is design review fiscal year 2024-0013. It is a design review, however, it is processed as a planned unit development. So therefore, that is why you're seeing the application here today. You're making a recommendation to City Council, who is the final deciding body. The drafted decision document is written in the approval as well as in the denial. All the findings and conditions can be edited by the commission. And I did end up sending out an updated decision document where on page 9 and 10, I also provided you that page 9 and 10 with the updated findings that I'll go into here in a little bit. So on Monday, September 16th, 2024, the applicant as well as staff met with the design review consultants to discuss the ongoing code compliance issues. The original submittal documents show that the floor plans show floor plans level 1 through 4 being dedicated to the self-storage facility use. However, the resubmittals now show portions of level 1 being dedicated to that use. The September 20 or the August 28th resubmittals show this change, and the staff report was updated to reflect that change. So you were reviewing those resubmitted documents review. The rest of the building is identified as a mix of office and retail space per those floor plans. But the consultant's biggest concerns were the design of the overall building, as it appears to be more of a storage and warehouse appearance as opposed to an office and retail. During that consultation, the applicant did provide updated renderings, which the consultant seemed to like more, as it did include more glazing and facing the East 42nd Street. But there are conditions that the consultants recommended that are not reflected in the decision document, being that more articulation and glazing be provided to meet that office-like appearance. Another concern that the consultants brought up and staff has as well in the staff report is the fact that the proposal does not appear to meet the intent or the findings of planned unit development as found in Garden City Code 86B7. So the intent of a planned unit development is to provide for a well-planned development which conforms to the objectives of Garden City Code 86B7, but it may deviate in certain respects from the zoning map and the district regulations. It is not the intent of a planned unit development to be used solely for the purposes of deviation to code standards unless it meets the objectives and findings that are found in code, as well as the staff report and further mentioned in the decision document. Also, up to 10% of the gross land area may be applied to other uses that are not allowed within the land use district based off of the findings of the commission. As the applicant and the commission has already kind of discussed here tonight, the gross land area of the site is 114,127 square feet, which allows only 11,413 square feet of essentially the gross site area, which is shown in the floor plans on floor 1 to be dedicated to the self-storage use. Self-storage is a prohibited use in the C2 zoning district. And a condition has been drafted in the decision document to only allow for that 11,413 square feet to be dedicated to a prohibited use of self-storage as per the PUD code allows. As a planned unit development, the application has the ability to request waivers to code standards so long as the request is not to solely deviate from the code standards. The applicant has not formally requested any waivers to any code standards despite the code compliance issues as mentioned in the staff report. And staff believes the most prominent issue at hand would not only be the prohibited use discussion, but also the parking discussion and how the site appears to be currently underparked or underparked. So based off of the August 28th, 2024 resubmittals, staff was able to determine that a storage facility at 11,413 square feet only needs 6 parking spaces because it's considered a low use per the parking code. But the remainder of the square footage of that proposed building would require 158 parking spaces. So the total would be 164 vehicular parking spaces. And that's just for the proposed building. Staff did not calculate the existing building's office parking space requirements, but there would be additional parking spaces required of that building. So as proposed and as existing, there are site plans indicating that there's 107 vehicular parking spaces, which would mean that the site is deficient 57 vehicle parking spaces for just the proposed structure. And then moving on, the applicant did touch on pedestrian connectivity. It seemed that the design review consultants were okay with the resubmittal documents showing pedestrian connectivity throughout the site. There is a requirement for a sidewalk on East 42nd Street, which currently exists. There was discussion regarding the proposed access as well as the existing access to the north, to which the applicant has agreed to provide like a shared access with the existing curb cut to Fishers. And ACHD is in agreement with that shared access as of right now. It is all one parcel, so there is no need for a shared parking or a shared access agreement. There is not a requirement for a sidewalk along Veterans. Well, code would require it, but it's an elevated difference. So Veterans would be much higher than the grade of the property. So staff did not find that a sidewalk was required at this point in time. With that, I'll stand for any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Veal. Questions from the commission? Commissioner Brown?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Deal, thank you very much. My questions are going to have to do with what we've already talked about a little bit with regard to the applicant. And that being, and you did a very good job of explaining while the applicant hasn't requested any waivers, apparently what we are being asked will result in a waiver being put in here, and it has to do with the 10% limitation of the prohibited thing in C2 area of self-service storage areas. And so my question is, would you please comment as to how you would see we as a commission could address what would be a waiver if we did what he is suggesting, where we would waive the 10% and make that 68%.
Yeah.
I would be interested in what your thoughts are about the feasibility of us doing that and how it would fit in.
Commissioner Brown, in the past, we have had similar discussions, not exactly regarding the 10% deviation or allowing 10% of prohibited uses. essentially, the applicant is requesting to use the planned unit development mechanism. So asking for a waiver to the additional standards set forth in the PUD code. It has not been allowed by the commission in the past. For example, when you've discussed the variety of housing requirements of a PUD, the commission has required that the subdivision requesting the PUD cannot request a waiver to that standard. So in just based off of historical conversations, I would say that the PUD requirements of the 10% would not be permitted.
Thank you very much for that comment, and I'm sure the rest of us will be considering that. Let's suppose for a minute that we devised a way of doing that, where we said that, yes, we were gonna do that, and I don't know how we would do that, but that's be later on conversation. What would the impact of that be on the deficiency in parking spaces? What would the impact of that be?
Yeah, so if the entire building was dedicated, or most of the building, 68% of the building was dedicated to the self-storage use, then whatever that square footage ends up being would be used to calculate the required parking spaces. So self-storage is a low use. So it's one space per 500 square feet of structure. So I don't have a calculator, but I can't do that mental math, but it would likely be less, I'm assuming.
It would probably quite a bit less. All right, thank you. That's the question I have.
Thank you, Commissioner Brown. Any other questions from the commissioners? Commissioner Smith?
I have a follow-up, Hannah. So adding a little bit to what Commissioner Brown was asking, let's say that we did grant a percentage exception, but then we based parking on that exception, and then these are converted to offices. Aren't we then severely deficient on our parking with no way to remedy it in the future?
Yes, Commissioner Smith.
Okay, just make sure I'm doing math correctly. Okay, and then same with, I saw in the staff report, there seem to be multiple references to it would be difficult to determine whether city resources or conditions would be appropriate, given that it's sort of a moving target. Is that what am I understanding that correctly, that what may be adequate for a storage facility may not be adequate for a future office building?
Yes, Commissioner Smith. So in the staff report, there was mention of like fire suppression or building code, like walls and firewalls. It just kind of depends on how that interior space is built out. And it might be that a interior remodel permit be required later in order to meet the requirements of that future use. It's no different than a normal multi-tenant building where like where tenants move in and out, and sometimes they require additional code safety for like life safety. It's not much different than that, but as of right now, it's difficult to tell what would be required.
So is there a mechanism or precedent for requiring, I guess what I'm imagining is, let's say we put, I guess I'm wondering if there's a mechanism for conditioning in the future. So let's say we said, well, this can be a storage facility for 5 years, but then it has to convert to an office facility. What mechanism would we have to enforce that if it didn't happen?
To enforce the
some kind of future condition.
Yeah, so this is similar to a conditional use permit discussion where like that use is only allowed to be there for X amount of years and then it needs to terminate. It's difficult to enforce that via a condition. Essentially, what our catch-all is is that a business or a tenant cannot move into a space unless they have a certificate of occupancy. And then at that point, we go through the proper permitting and code review processes. Mhm.
Any other questions for Ms. Beal?
Yes, Mr.
Commissioner
Chairman,
Shepherd?
I have a question. The way I understand this is this application as being from a planned unit development, it has to meet each of, well, I guess my question is, does it have to meet each of these findings listed in the staff report? Or does it also, is it like just the applicable ones? Because it talks about maximum choice of living environments and variety of housing, but this obviously isn't, you know, going to have any housing or residential use. And we haven't really talked about like open space, like creating a more useful pattern of open space and recreation areas. So I'm just not exactly sure, like, are we supposed to apply all of these to this application in order to?
Yeah,
recommend
Commissioner Shepherd. So it's whatever is applicable. And in the past, we have gone through each finding line by line, saying why it's in approval or why it's in denial. But you could ultimately have a couple findings that are in denial, but overall recommend approval or vice versa.
Thank you, Commissioner Shepherd. Any other questions for Ms. Beal? All right, hearing no more questions, we will go ahead and open it up to the public. We do have quite a few sign-up sheets. We will limit the testimony to 3 minutes. Again, when you come up to testify, please state your name and address for the record, and I'll keep time. We have a sign-up sheet by Alexander Leaf. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, sorry. Life. Okay, sounds good, thank you. We also have one from Ian Carroll. Okay. And so I will go ahead and read this into the record here shortly. I just want to make sure that I know who's going to be testifying. Chris Taylor, okay, and you're going to testify, correct? Weston Ellerbrook, you're going to testify, okay? Mr. Hamish Bell, thank you. Hayden Farrell, okay. Jeff Banks, you here to testify?
Yes.
Okay. And then we have the applicant. All right, so we have 2 that will not be testifying, and then we will get to the folks on Zoom. Ian Carroll, reading into the record, non-compliant with zoning and 13 non-compliance with codes of the city, reduction of property value for neighbors. And he opposes the application. And Mr. Alexander, opposed building of storage units on 42nd doesn't fit the community of a river park school living neighborhood and doesn't fit zoning code. P&Z should stick to the zoning code and deny this application in favor of a future project that fits. The storage project is not compliant with 12/31 sections on the Garden City staff report. So let the record show that those are submitted testimony. We will then move on to Mr. Chris Taylor. Thank you. You may go ahead and approach, and again, please state your name and address for the record, please.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, thank you. Chris Taylor, my business address or residential address,
Residential address, yeah.
757 North Quarry View Way, Boise, 83712. I can't speak today about any zoning requirements and any of those processes. I just want to speak as an owner. I'm an owner of Fisher's Technology. My 2 partners are here. And in our search of, we've got vacant land there and we want to put it to use for our community. In our search of a good use of that property, this idea surfaced in our research of the blossoming community around us of higher density apartments and condos. The research suggests that storage units is in need and will continue to be needed in that community. So it was interesting to us, particularly when we saw with Forge Builders, who are also here, such a beautiful piece of artwork that fits in well with what Garden City, at least our perspective, what Garden City is trying to do. So we were impressed with the project, the use of the land. The other concern that we had was traffic on 42nd Street, and this use, far above many other opportunities for that, did not add to the traffic of 42nd Street, which is very, very appealing to us. So that's how it came together, along with Forge Builders, who do this around the country. We're very pleased with our partnership with them, and it just came together as something that we thought, let's give this a go and see if it's a good use of our land in Garden City.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Any questions? All right, thank you.
All right, thank you.
All right, Weston Ellerbrook. Rick.
My name is Weston Ellerbrick, 4220 North Adams Street, Garden City, Idaho 83714. So being someone who lives just down the street from them in the Crosshatch Apartments, I can absolutely say that we need storage in this area. The area is rising with more and more apartments, and my personal building holds no storage whatsoever. And it would be a great addition to the area. This storage especially adds little to no traffic, and I would hate to see any more traffic get added to this very small road. Best of all, it's safe. The public art murals, I think, are a wonderful addition. They're very colorful. They add a lot of variety to an area that right now is booming with like children, and it's a new and upcoming area. But frankly, storage would be the best thing in this area, again, for the safety, for the parking, for the driving, for the traffic. And I can speak at least to the Crosshatch Apartments that I have no storage. And I would, as much as I love my apartment, I would definitely like to store some more things around that area. So again, I would just like to say I'm in support of waiving the 10% requirement, increasing it so that the storage can be allowed in the area. So thank you all. I appreciate it.
You, sir. Any questions? All right, thank you very much. Mr. Bell.
Hello, thanks for listening to me. My name's Hamish Bell, and my address is 4708 Fenton. I am in support of this project. This is a Class A self-storage project, and with the high density housing that is all around this facility, I think there's definitely a proven need for it. The impact on the neighbors is going to be minimal. No noise, less traffic, safe, secure, and a good looking property. So I don't see the negative outweighing the positive that you're going to get out of a Class A facility there. Thanks.
Sir. Mr. Farrell.
Yeah, good evening. Hayden Farrell. My home address is 12913 North Town Ridge Road, Boise, Idaho. With Hamish, we have a property in Garden City on Fenton, and we believe with working with Fishers and looking at the use of that property, that storage would be a good need for that. And with all the apartments and multifamily that's going in around here, there's definitely a need for the climate controlled Class A facilities. I've been in Garden City. I surfed the wave. I've been down there since 2012 and seen the growth that's come in over the last 12, 14 years, and really think it would be a good use of that site. So thank you.
Thanks, sir. Mr. Banks.
Good evening. I'm Jeff Banks, 3660 North Adams Street, 83714 in the Waterfront District. Here originally to to testify and give my support personally for the project. There's need, as far as my personal research for climate controlled storage. I have had and owned some small businesses over time that have had need for storage of inventory, parts, etc., and that can't be found. Beyond my personal testimony, in my day job, I'm president of Northwest Bank, which is a chartered Idaho bank. And I wasn't going to bring this up here, but in the discussion, we do a lot of community reinvestment activity and talk with we do a lot of small business lending in Garden City and in Boise. And a number of the entrepreneurs and small businesses that are considering Garden City do have a need for storage, climate controlled storage needs. So beyond the residential piece for storage, I think someone could view the building as an incubator for small business and entrepreneurial business in Garden City. And so I wanted to put that on the record.
Thank you, sir. Is there anybody else that's here personally that would like to testify? All right, seeing none. Is there anybody on Zoom that would like to testify?
Yes.
Please state your name and address for the record, please.
Good afternoon or good evening. My name is Brad McGurr. My address is 4213 North Hardtail Lane in Garden City, virtually across the street from this proposed planned unit development. First of all, I want to thank you, Planning Commission. I know that public service is sometimes a thankless job, and I just wanted to let you know that we all appreciate your concern regarding this development, proposed development. I don't have a fundamental opposition to storage units per se, but I am very concerned about two things. The first being traffic. I'm sure you already know, based upon prior developments in the area, 42nd Street is a very, very busy street. We have children that go to the Boys and Girls Club. They go to Future Public School or Answer Charter School. And there are backups of cars every weekday. And the children use Riverside Park every single day. And that's before the development of the crosshatch apartments. So there's a grave concern regarding traffic. I don't agree with some of the prior speakers saying there would be no noise and quote unquote less traffic. My concern is how can one, if the street is suitable for the proposed development if we don't know what the development is? Looking at the staff report and the proposal, it calls storage, offices, retail, clubhouse, etc. And to paraphrase Commissioner Smith's comment, it's a moving target. We don't know what this is going to be. And Mr. Hatch made a comment earlier that somewhere down the road, quote unquote, will determine the use. It sounds like they want to move Fisher into that building at some point in time, but as we sit here today, it's completely unclear as to what that building is supposed to be. So I'm very concerned about the traffic effects here. I recognize the gentleman from Crosshatch Apartments needing storage, and I appreciate that, and I couldn't agree more. But right now, what the Planning Commission is asked to do is to consider a planned unit development with no identity. So that concerns me. If you look at the requirements on pages 8 and 9 of the staff report for the finding that a planned unit development is appropriate, the decision-making body, quote unquote, must find the application meets following findings. And one of those findings is subsection E, the streets and thoroughfares proposed are suitable and adequate to carry anticipated traffic, and increased densities will not generate traffic in such amounts as to overload the street network outside the planned unit development. Again, this is a moving target. If it were just a storage facility, I agree that's a low parking requirement. It's probably a low traffic requirement. But as it stands now, somewhere down the road, we're going to find out what this really is. Also, to find a conditional use permit to be appropriate, the Planning Commission must, quote unquote, determine a number of things, including that the use is not in conflict with the comprehensive plan or other adopted plan policies or ordinances of the city. I've looked at the comprehensive plan. I wondered, does this put the garden back in Garden City? Does it improve the image of Garden City? I don't know. The artistic drawing that we saw just now does not match what's in the staff report. Staff report has 6 windows facing 42nd Street, not what we just saw.
Mr.
The second, I'm sorry.
Your 3 minutes is up. Can you please summarize?
Thank you. I'll just give you 30 seconds. If you can give me 30 seconds, I'll wrap up. I'm the one that brought up the utility poles, and I appreciate the fact they want to bury them. I'm looking at page 16, and it talks about so long as permission is granted by Idaho Power, and that in doing so does not create undue hardship. Undue hardship to whom? I think those poles need to go, and not just the 3 poles that are on 42nd Street in front of the property, but they have wires going across the street to one more pole at Riverfront Park, which if you look at the second picture in my email, which was not included in the staff report, that's at a 20% angle right now. I'm sure it wasn't installed that way, but it's leaning over. And I would respectfully request that as a condition of approval, that all the poles, all 4 poles, including the one across the street, be removed if that's appropriate and adopted by Idaho Power. So I guess my 3 minutes are up. And again, I appreciate your concern and your time.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else from Zoom that would like to testify? All right. Seeing no other people on Zoom, we will go ahead and move it back to Mr. Hatch for your rebuttal.
Chairman Montoya and Commissioners, thank you again. I'd like to briefly comment on some of the neighborhood feedback and then stand for any questions. For starters, there was a question that was addressed to Ms. Veal from Commissioner Smith in regards to the use and if this use is a moving target. That was also a question that one of the neighbors had. I feel it's crystal clear, so I'll summarize very precisely. We're proposing a structure that is intended for self-storage at this time. In the future, we feel that we have done a parking analysis and proposed that analysis for low and medium density uses in the C2 zone. If for clarity, we need to request a waiver for the high density uses of the C2, we could do that. But the intent would be if we need to apply verbiage for it, we aren't intending to have high density uses on this site, nor do the neighbors want that. And so we've provided a solution that has a low density solution and a medium density solution for optimal uses for office space in the future. Fishers uses theirs at a medium density to low density use now, and we would be intending with this transition to fulfill that, not increasing the density beyond that to the high density. From Hannah Veal's report, she has to assume the C2 of all the C2 uses. And so in the past, similar to the BMC and PJD facilities, we did it off of 52nd and 48th. Those PUDs, when they came through, the uses were evaluated and stricken for high density uses and uses that were not appropriate for those PUDs, so that in the future, if somebody wanted to do a winery next to a bunch of industrial stuff where you're going to triple the parking, you're not going to end up getting like, what we're experiencing over at Birds, where people were parking halfway, down roads forever. So if there are high density uses that the commission deems appropriate, we're fine striking those, but we did do the parking analysis for low and medium density uses to optimize the current need and the future uses as intended. The other consideration that was brought up with the commission and also from Hannah was the office appearance. And we did have some initial comments from the design review to provide additional enhancements. And so we did increase the glazing percentage on all facades to 15%, a minimum of 15%, although our street facing facades is up to 50%. If the commission is seeing that as something that needs to increase for our request, we are more than happy to increase that percentage to something that the commission deems appropriate for that office appearance as needed. In addition, there was concern for the density and uses in relationship to the street and infrastructure. And if a parking study is needed at this time, they're rarely needed for a self-storage facility, but if the commission would so choose to have us analyze this for a medium density traffic generation for that office use, which would be the highest density use that we would like on the facility, we would be more than happy to oblige that request as well. And I'll stand for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hatch. Any questions for the applicant? Mr. Smith?
So and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like what you're saying is that if we were to condition this project as if it were a medium density office building, but to be used for a storage facility for some undetermined amount of time, that would be acceptable. You'd be willing to essentially condition it as something it isn't yet. Is that accurate?
Commissioner Smith, we are trying to be very specific and precise, meeting code today for something for the future. And the main concern with that would be parking. And to speak on that at a greater level, there was some comments made about type of construction and if there's an adaptability in the future. The Statesman building had to go through a substantial remodel in order to get it up to the construction methodology of a self-storage facility. To bring a self-storage facility back down to the level of construction of an office building is vastly easier. The fire suppression required for self-storage is far more involved than anything that would take place in an office building.
And the other conditions, the landscaping, that sort of thing, is it your opinion that wouldn't change or wouldn't need to be changed, that it would be the same for a self-storage facility as it would be for an office building because the exterior isn't changing? Or are you asking for those conditions to be shifted downward as well?
Commissioner Smith, great question. So I'm working with design review. We feel that we've satisfied their requests and intent. They did have us increase our southern property boundary setback for an additional landscape enhancements. And we did have a couple different rounds with design review in regards to the aesthetics as well as landscaping. So at this time, we feel that that would be the same dialogue and approval that we would have for an office building.
Mr. Brown?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hatch. So if I wanted to sum this up, it would be the following. And in the event that we were to recommend approval of this application the way it is written right now, we would have to add into that 2 waivers. Now, those would be to waive in some manner the 10% limitation on self-service storage facility and make that so it would be 68%, and to waive a parking requirement of 57 spaces, if I understand what Hannah said. Is that correct?
Commissioner Brown, I always try to come to these with the least amount of waivers requested.
Pardon?
Commissioner Brown, I try to come to these every time with the least amount of waivers I possibly can. So the consideration is, yes, we could request a higher parking use density waiver. That doesn't satisfy the concerns of the neighbors. The neighbors don't want a high density use in here. So my consideration would be, would it be possible to just restrict that we don't provide a high density use in this area? And then in that case, we're not requesting a waiver, we're just instilling a restriction requested by the neighbors.
With regard to the parking?
High density use parking.
And what about the 10% limitation on self-service storage?
Commissioner Brown, I try to request as little waivers as possible, but we would still be requesting that waiver, sir.
Thank you.
Any other questions for the applicant?
Mr. Hatch, So thank you for doing the math for us on the 68%. What, do you have notes on what square footage that reflects? Instead of 11,400, is it
That would be
6.8 times that? I guess.
that would be the duration of the floors minus the amenities, minus the office spaces. And so that would be the intended intent of the application.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions for the applicant? Thank you, Mr. Hatch.
Thank you.
All right, at this time, we will now close the public hearing and discuss the matter amongst the commissioners. Commissioner Shepherd.
Thank you, Chairman Montoya. I am trying to balance the different concerns of the neighbors, because there's some that want the storage and others that don't. And I do see the storage facility being a low density use in terms of parking and traffic, and as far as other things that could be there. And I would want, if we were to move forward with recommending this for approval, I would be in favor of having conditions to restrict them from any kind of high density use in the future and keeping it low to medium. Because I do agree that 42nd Street does have a lot of traffic and children, and I do think a self-storage facility is needed in the area, and also it is a low traffic. Seems to me that it would be low traffic compared to other things that could be there. I'm a little uncertain about how I feel about not having not knowing what the future plans are, and hearing and also just the fact that the PUD only allows for 10% of self-storage space, and the C2 zone doesn't allow for any self-storage at all. So of course we would have to have that waiver put in there. I would like to hear from the other commissioners. I'm still kind of trying to look through all of my notes and try to.
Commissioner Brown.
I meant, I think it was Hannah that pointed out that perhaps I think that we're trying to use the PUD part of our code for an inappropriate purpose here. And let me explain why. I understand that, don't get me wrong. I'm very familiar with this area, and I absolutely can see where they need storage down there. And if we recommended approval to this, what we are recommending approval for is for a self-service storage facility that has a couple other things with it that you ordinarily wouldn't see a storage facility. But the way it's now written, if we did it, we wouldn't be putting any kind, unless we rewrite the whole thing, any kind of a time frame on when this would be changed by, and not any really limitation on what could be put in there. And so it would appear to you we do that. So that brings us to what the requirements of a PUD are. And I'm convinced that Hannah correctly said it. I don't believe, and I'm certainly going to want to defer to my fellow commissioners that are attorneys. But if I understand it, this is actually a prohibition in a C2 to have a storage facility, a self-service storage facility. And there is an exception. You can do 10% of things that are not allowed under that, but we wouldn't be doing that. And we would be creating a waiver for something that we haven't done before. And we're I don't think we have the ability to do it. That's my thoughts about it. And the issues about the parking, I suppose that we could sit down and put some kind of a limitation in there that would require it, that then not convert it to any kind of a use that would require more parking than what was available for doing. But it sounds to me like that about the minimum parking that is required would be required if it was a self-service storage facility. And anything else that you do more is going to get more of the parking. I understand also what the people are saying about the traffic, but that is not a consideration in my opinion. The highway district is certified that 42nd Street right down it is and the only collector street that's in this part of Garden City, and that's Adams. So the traffic, the additional traffic, that street, I know it appears to people that it's highly trafficked, but it's fully improved and it will handle its traffic that's going to go in there. So that's not an issue that I'm worrying about. And the other issue that I think I ought to mention, I don't recall us requiring a developer to make changes to the power poles and what they're doing. I think that's the responsibility of Idaho Power, and especially including one of them that apparently is about to fall over. So I don't think that's an issue. So I want to go back to my thinking on this. I'm not in favor of us recommending approval on the way it's written. And I'm not in favor, I don't think we have the capability of actually waiving that prohibition in the C2 area, which what we would be doing. I don't think we have the power to do that. And of course, I am keeping in mind that we are a recommending body, and I don't think it would be right for me to say, yes, I recommend approval of this and sort of put it on their lap. That's my thoughts.
Thank you, Commissioner Brown. Commissioner Wild?
Thanks. As is often the case, I agree with Commissioner Brown. And I'll just, Commissioner Smith used the phrase moving target. That is what this is. This is something that they propose a use now, and they propose a different use at some date in the future, which complicates things. I mean, this is not really black and white. If it were black and white, we'd be here with a rezoned use, and they want to use it for office or they want to use it for storage. I appreciate all the testimony that we've heard tonight. Market demand's not part of our job duties as public servants for the Planning and Zoning Commission. So I agree. There is probably a great need for for storage in that area with all the density going in over there. It's a bridge too far for me on the C2 use and the 10%. It's a prohibited use in C2, period. 10% is allowed. Leniency is being requested at 68%. Why do we even have a code if we're going to waive and or reduce that requirement, even if we had the authority? And I'm not sure that we do. So again, like I said, with Commissioner Brown, I anticipate recommending denials.
Thank you, Commissioner Wild. Commissioner Smith?
So I really liked this idea for two reasons. I liked the idea of high quality storage in the area, and I really liked the idea of a low traffic use because of the kids and schools. And so my questions were directed at trying to figure out if it was possible to condition within the PUD framework so significantly that it essentially made the use a different use other than the the very small amount that was used inside, where essentially all the other conditions were as if it were a residential use. But I agree. I think that we are trying to, or if we have recommended approval, we would be trying to shoehorn a rezone into a PUD. And I don't believe the code allows us to do that, even if we wanted to. And I don't believe that we can condition it sufficiently within the PUD model to get there.
Mr. Chair, I'll just follow up on Commissioner Smith's comment. I showed her my comment on my piece of paper here that says shoehorning. Mr. Hatch is very familiar with our PUD code, and we see a lot of PUD applications, and we see a lot of shoehorning. And when I don't say a bridge too far lightly, we approve a lot of projects that really don't fit well within the PUD code. This one really doesn't fit very well at all into the PUD code.
Thank you, commissioners. For the most part, I agree with the fellow commissioners. I think that this is an interesting application. I understood the request and the modification through the application process to try and get it to where it did meet the code. I too have a concern with what would happen approving something like this, especially when it's almost completely using the PUD in a way that it wasn't designed for. And I'm looking at that where the intent and the language of the code strictly says 10%. And the concern would be that it's, you know, an attempt to sidestep zoning and use the PUD to rewrite. And that's concerning for me because downstream that could create all sorts of problems. And so I would be in favor of probably approving as conditioned with 10%, because I do think the storage is a needed use. I do appreciate Fisher being there and being a tenant and, you know, good steward in Garden City. But again, the 10%, the C2 is prohibiting storage. It's a large leap. So I'd agree with the fellow commissioners on recommending denial based on the request for the storage facility. Any other discussion?
Just to follow up.
Commissioner Shepherd?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, that was also the thing that was really sticking for me was the C2 and the 10%, like in going so far above it. And I appreciate hearing my more experienced colleagues agreeing with that. So I also would recommend denial without, well, if it was only just 10%, then I would be in favor of that waiver, but not as it is at 16%.
Thank you, Commissioner. So again, we are a recommending body, and so we've heard from all the commissioners. Is there further discussion on this matter? Hearing none, I will entertain a motion.
Mr. Chair,
Commissioner Wild.
I move to recommend denial of DSR FY 2024-13.
I have a motion from Commissioner Wild. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
I have a second from Commissioner Brown. Any discussion? No further discussion. We will go ahead and take this to vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any noes? The ayes have it. Mr. Hatch. All right. Next item on the agenda is the discussion. This is the work session CPA FY 2024-004 buffers. So with this item, this is scheduled as a work session based on the items that we discussed last month regarding proposed ordinance change. And we will hear from Jenna. Thank you.
Good evening, Chairman and members of the commission. And today, as the chairman has noted, is a work session rather than a public hearing, which is scheduled for the next meeting. just to discuss how we got here today. Buffers is a topic that's was identified by the city council as a high priority to address in the city code. The city code currently does look to some provisions. There are some provisions that address buffering in zones, particularly perimeter landscaping and landscaping provisions, setbacks, and design standards of structures. In a planning world, I'm sure you all know this, but just to state the obvious, buffers can help with compatibility between zoning districts. And then in certain instances, within the same zoning district between different uses. What we've seen from the city over the recent past, where we're really seeing testimony requesting more of a buffer is actually between densities between residential uses. Certainly, we've seen it in the past between residential uses and non-residential uses, depending on what those are. But again, in the recent past, it tends to be more along the same type of use. It's just different densities of those uses. In the original staff report, as well as the work session memorandum, there is some discussion. There's quite a bit of literature that's out there on how to address buffers, but there was just a really succinct article that was included from the Municipal Research and Service Center 2017 Visualizing Compatible Density that looks at what different densities can look like. I think that that's one of the things that can be foreboding when looking at applications if you're within a neighborhood, is what does that density look like, whether it be 35 units per acre or 100 units per acre. And we've certainly seen both of those densities proposed within the city. And that article succinctly states what a lot of the literature says is making the streetscape and addressing the pedestrian elements, it really can help with compatibility within the buffers or in creating buffers. And so it helps, I guess, mask the feeling of that density or the intensity of uses. And with that, I wanted to note that some of the items that were addressed did include the street presence or public presence or adjacent to uses presence, landscaping. And then there was quite a bit of look at the setbacks, but not a lot of changes proposed to the setbacks. I also wanted to note that staff did take some work. There was a committee that was convened in 2019 to look at how the river is addressed in Garden City. There had previously been an overlay that was repealed, and that committee was convened to look at how development can occur adjacent to the river. COVID happened, and then quick development, reducing staff capacity happened, and that draft ordinance, even though the committee had convened, I believe, 10 times, maybe 8 times, and we actually have a member of that committee that's here tonight. It was ready to go through the public hearing process. It did get put on hold, but in addressing the buffers, there are applicable codes that committee did look at. And what was proposed to you at the last iteration, it needed a little bit more of that work brought into it to make sense. And so there is now a proposal that wasn't there last month that specifically addresses the 8M, and that's really looking at how to deal with what, not scientifically, but what Garden City's code refers to as the riparian area right now. And then there's another big question that's looming when you look at the comprehensive plan, whether or not the R3 zoning in particular is correctly zoned throughout the city. In saying that, the comprehensive plan looks at the areas north of the river and north of Marigold, west of Glenwood, as medium to low density or low density residential. Whereas if you look south of the river, east of Glenwood, that whole area, except for the specific area, planned area, so the fairgrounds, or the industrial area, is designated as mixed use, either mixed use residential or mixed use commercial. And so the comp plan does look at those areas redeveloping quite a bit different. But then if you look at the zoning map, you have quite a bit of that area, particularly around the Marigold area as R3. And then you also have quite a bit in the east side of town. And with that, I will jump into some of the specific changes and questions, but this is a work session. Please feel free to stop me, ask questions along the way. I'm not intending this to be an overly formal format. Oh, before I jump in there too, we've heard the neighborhood that is west of Glenwood, individuals within that neighborhood request that the R3 zoning have a height limitation be put back in place. The previous height restriction prior to 2014 and the R3 zone that was removed was 45 feet. Staff has heard individuals say lower than that, as low as 20 feet, which would be a single level home. But staff has suggested that if that's to be put back in place, that 45 feet may be the best, just to reduce the number of non-conforming structures that would immediately be created. And also to be careful about a takings on the allowed density. But staff would suggest that 45 feet could allow for the allowed 35 units per acre density. What could happen there is a reduction in density, or not density, design flexibility in that instance. Because of the mixed use and the way that the east side of town is redeveloping, as staff has suggested not having that same limitation east of Glenwood, where there's a mixed use intention to allow for some of that design flexibility should the commission move forward as drafted, and think that that height limitation is something that you would recommend putting back in code. The other discussion.
So Jenna, I have a question on that. So in the staff report, it talks about, so in 2014, there was a height restriction of 45 feet. And then that was removed. And so there was no, for the last 10 years, there hasn't been any height restriction. But presumably there's been a number of properties transacted in that area.
Chairman, it depends on which part of town, but yes, there's been quite a bit of redevelopment that has occurred.
And then I don't have the zoning map up, so excuse me if this is answered through that, but is the line that we're talking about strictly Glenwood? And to the west? Because there's also the frontage along Glenwood. And is there any applications that are currently being contemplated where that would be potentially impacted?
Chairman, there's no R3 that's directly adjacent to Glenwood. And I'm happy to pull up a zoning map right now. And then I did just want to note that there was a commissioner that did note that this zoning map states MU, and there is a typo, it's M, per the Ada County Assessor records as well as the zoning code. But here you can see this whole area here in this kind of yellow mustardy color is the R3, and then there's R3 here, R3 here, R3 in these areas.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. And then staff.
Mr. Chairman,
Commissioner Brown.
Janet, but even if we did what was being requested, this would only be in those areas that are west of Glenwood, right?
Chairman, Commissioner Brown, staff has suggested that this, if all changes are made that's proposed in this draft, no property would change zoning designation at this point in time, but there is a designate or a discussion of if the R3 that's located here should stay R3, and then there should this property, should the city explore at a future point in time, and that be redesignated as mixed use, and consider that mixed use residential. And then the C2, this kind of pinky red color, is very much being utilized as a mixed use zoning designation right now. If that should be the zoning designation for mixed use commercial as identified in the comprehensive plan. Those two as identified in the comprehensive plan. So that's a big discussion. And that's one of the big questions that staff has for you. Another is the height restriction. If that's a direction that the commission thinks would be appropriate to move towards putting that back in.
Mr. Chair.
Mhm.
Janet, I'm reviewing the height restriction language set out in the report you prepared. Thank you. Having lived in the neighborhood west of Glenwood for almost 20 years, I don't live there now. My fellow commissioner does. It says individuals from the neighborhood west of Glenwood have requested that be reinstated. And then it goes on to state all the problems that reinstating it would cause. And I know this is the work session where we're going to give you some guidance about that. Because I swim in a world of politics every day, can you elaborate on individuals from the neighborhood west of Glenwood have requested?
Certainly.
Are they developers? I mean, they're not developers, right?
No.
It's the opposite of that. It's
correct.
Some neighborhood association or
no formal neighborhood association of this at this point in time. It's been so for example, we recently had a neighborhood meeting as the first step to go through the code amendments. And during that neighborhood meeting, we did not receive anything formally in writing, but there was quite a discussion. And individuals from the neighborhood, not an association, were discussing that they would like to see that reinstated. And years ago as well, for a while, when there was an application that was quite contentious that came through, and that was part of the testimony that went through during that time. So there's not been a formal request, but there has been murmurings and testimony and discussions.
So neighborhood meeting and individuals, 3 to 10 individuals?
Oh, goodness. I know that this isn't a public hearing, but I do know that somebody might have an opinion in the audience.
I guess I'm just, I'm only trying to point out that we represent the city
Mhm.
of 12-ish thousand people. And if there's a handful of individuals who would like that reinstated, and it's going to create a bevy of other problems, I agree it would, by the way.
Mhm.
I'm generally not supportive of that. And I just want to kind of highlight that word individuals. If there were 3 neighborhood associations who'd signed a petition, I'd probably be going entirely the other direction.
Okay.
So are you saying that you would be, you are not in favor of limiting the height? Or you're in
Maintain
favor?
the status quo.
I'm in favor of that too. Some of those, I suspect the people they were talking about, they're south of the river. But in those areas that are that mustard colored, that are over there all along State Street, there are a bunch of housing units that are being built over there. I think that they probably exceed 45 feet.
The ones right on State Street, I think probably do.
Absolutely.
Sure,
And south of there. So I'm just saying that I think there could be a lot of problems. I agree with you.
That was a quick thank you.
Yeah.
And then I guess another one that might be pretty easy to address is if you agree with the inclusion of the items addressed through the Boise River ordinance. And there's been additional items that have been added because of that. There's certainly time before the next meeting to renotice, but staff would suggest maintaining or adding that 8M section to help suss out some of the other setbacks and why are we having habitat setbacks suggested. We could do that, but is that a direction you want to do or go or address that at a later date?
Jenna, did I hear you correctly saying that you would add a section 8M to add back in those overlays or the setbacks from the river to protect, is that to protect the riparian areas you're talking about?
And Chairman Commissioners Shepherd, that's correct. In the ordinance that was prepared, the draft potential ordinance prepared for tonight, it's page 33. There's Article M, Boise River Natural Resource, that is suggested as potentially being able to be added. And that really would take the majority of the work that committee did and added in, with the exception of going through and looking at specific uses. There are things that they did that staff hasn't pulled into this particular ordinance. Certainly, we can pause on that and staff can bring it back out of this draft, or we can renotice and make sure that it's noticed adequately prior to next month. To further expand on that, there were items that may not have made complete sense in trying to address buffers of the public realm, specifically the green belt, and dealing with setbacks. In that staff was already touching the setbacks. Staff brought in some of the setbacks that were suggested through that committee's work, including some setbacks from critical habitat, et cetera. And then another matter is allowing for frontage onto the green belt, but not requiring it, and discussing what that would look like. And also what fencing would look like adjacent to the green belt and allowing for a buffer space between the travel way and the green belt itself. And that's a safety consideration that they looked at. So if somebody falls on their bike, that they're not falling directly into a wall.
I think that for what it's worth, I think that buffer makes a lot of sense. Whatever, however long ago it was when the Riverfront District was zoned and approved. I don't know that we anticipated that those backyards that are basically on the green belt with a fence, gate, all that, it's a risk. And I think it does. It makes some sense to space that a little bit. So I can support that.
Great, thank you very much. And along those lines, to point out, one of the suggested matters on fences is that it would be capped at the height limitations. And then there's a suggestion, if there's a wall and fences on top of it, would be set back 1 inch for every inch above it would be. So you know, if you had a 6-foot fence on top, it'd be set back 6 feet. So you'd have kind of a tiering. A 3-foot fence would be set back 3 foot, 3 foot on a retaining wall. Another matter that probably doesn't garner much discussion is one of the suggestions that since the last meeting was somebody had indicated, what about lighting privacy? Currently code does discuss trespass of light from cars, but it does not fully suss out lighting as it relates to trespassing from your building or your site. And so there's some language to downshield or to have cutoff, it's called cutoff lighting on site. There was also a request, well, what about noise? Garden City Code does not have, outside of the state statutes regarding noise, Garden City Code does not have any. Staff hasn't added any in there. It's something that cities talked about a lot, but if that's something that you'd like to see, a noise ordinance that's suggested as part of this, that is something that staff can work on. And then
Jenna, on the noise discussion, but there are sections of code that do discuss hours of operation, correct?
Chairman, that is correct. There are particular uses that have noise requirements or hours of operations, and those are scattered through the uses versus an overarching. I do want to note that where we tend to get complaints on noise is construction, anecdotally from a staff's perspective. And one draft condition that we have in our templates as of recent is limiting the hours of operation for construction unless they notify the neighborhood. We had an a project that because of the amount of concrete work they were doing, they had to start at a certain time and have the trucks come. And that was hard on the neighborhood for that week or so that they were doing that. But they did notify the neighborhood, and staff would suggest that that's something that would allow for the development to occur if they did notify. But it's not in code or right now unless directed otherwise. One thing, a big discussion item is visual privacy. That was identified in the previous draft that you received, as well as this draft. And that's noting that measures that are, the design of structures that are adjacent to residential dwellings in the R1 or R2 zones shall consider measures to include visual privacy. And I think I need to look, it's 2 places dealing with non-residential and residential construction. I think it says R3 in one of the wordings. And then it provides examples to including placing a smaller scale structure. So say maybe there's an apartment building that places their garage between the existing residences in the apartments. Placing trees to prevent views, stepping back the structure, and increasing the setback or strategic window placing, but it's not prescriptive of what would need to be done. When the design review consultants reviewed this, they wanted it to be drafted carefully that it's not visual privacy shall be met, because that could hang up an application arbitrarily. Not that it's not a desired intent, but they were trying to be careful on the legal back end.
But also to be broad enough where a creative architect can, because every site's different, every plan's different, measures to address visual privacy can take many different forms: trees, windows, window shapes, no windows at all, whatever it might be. So I think keeping it broad like that is good, without a shall.
Thank you. Another item that was brought up for discussion through the commission feedback, and thank you very much for taking the extra time. I know that that's a lot of work, and so I do appreciate your help in making this a good ordinance. But there is an increase in glazing for first floor facades that are fronting the public right of way or green belt, et cetera. So it wouldn't be all facades, but those fronting increased to 50%. And so is that too much? Is the question there.
Criteria, I don't know. What percent it should be.
That was an increase from 30, correct?
Yeah.
30, 35 or 30. Looking at Hannah, who knows the code like the back of her hand.
So, and I made a comment regarding that, and specifically that you could theoretically have 3-4 sides that are all facing a public road, because it was not exclusive to a public road, it was also to a right of way, correct? Like
Chairman,
natural
that's correct.
paths and all that. So you could have all 4 sides that would have to have 50% glazing, which is a lot of glass. So
On the first floor facade.
first floor, yeah.
Yep.
So are you saying that we ought to leave it like 30?
I thought it was 30 and then it was bumped up to 50.
Is the glazing just for commercial? Or all building?
That's found in the non-residential. And let me make sure it's, and the multifamily. So it would not catch single family residential in that.
So but it does have an 8-4 B-4 section B9. The first floor facade fronting greenbelt or public right of way shall include 50% of the first floor facade dedicated to pedestrian elements such as but not limited to windows, decks, balconies, showcase plazas. So that one's not specifically for glazing. Then we have it on page 24 as well. The first floor facades. So it's at least 50% for all other facades visible shall be at least 30% from 15.
That's correct. So it would be for all instead of just retail uses for non-residential on the front facade, and then from 15 to 30% on other it's visible. And then the theory behind that, I'm not saying it's the right number, and this is for discussion with the commission, just noting why, is that there have been case studies where there are blank walls or with areas without eyes on the street, where it's who killed the downtown. And so as people walk adjacent to large blank walls, they tend to be uncomfortable and not want to be there and be present anymore. And so that vibrancy and vitality on the street, the architectural, specifically windows or glazing, is important to that. Can let you think about that, or do you want me to move on, or and have you think about that and come back to it?
Sounds like I'm the only one that had any
Okay.
concerns,
I
so
know
we
that.
can move on.
Okay.
I'm good with what she wants to do, but I do want to go back for a second, Mr. Chairman. So did you get what you needed on the sound thing?
I guess you didn't say one way or another. I interpreted that you were not wanting staff to have a noise ordinance in addition to what's already
I
there.
don't, I want to support that. I'm not an expert. I haven't researched what you do in the city and residential areas or otherwise about sound. Well, I have researched extensively and wrote a technical manual one time about the sound requirements having to do with putting sound walls up on highways.
Mm-hmm.
I actually had it published. And what that leads me to believe, we shouldn't get into that. We're not qualified. I mean, I'm sure that there are, if we put that on you to do that, I'm sure there's a whole raft of different opinions and data on what you can do. And I would think that you should leave it like it is.
And Chairman Commissioner Brown, over my tenure, noise has come up quite a bit, including one public hearing where somebody did a blowhorn. So it's and been a discussion, and one of the things where the city has discussed but not moved forward with noise is if you do it based on decibels, it can be very difficult because just the ambient decibels adjacent to State Street may push you over the code allowance.
I guarantee you will be over it. And there I am. I have a lot of knowledge in that, and you're exactly right. It's why in federal projects where you are required to consider sound walls, that in this paper that I wrote, I recommended, for example, to the highway district that you not try and consider doing it on local streets because of that very requirement.
Mm-hmm.
And even in the federal highways, when you do it, you're not allowed by federal law. You can't base the design based upon taking the measurements with an audiograph where you go out and you measure it. Instead, you have to model it through computer models and use the models because they have the capability of, if you go out along State Street, you'll find you're already exceeding it before you even put it in. And so that I would support what you said. I would leave it like it is and not do anything further.
I agree. I'll add that it's really difficult to enforce.
Yeah.
Code
Amen.
enforcement police officers don't have little decibel machines. I know there are some you can get on your phone. It's really annoying in court to try to prove a decibel level. And
Yeah.
I think it's something people put in code just to feel good, but it's really tough to do anything with it on the enforcement side.
And again, based on the use, we have, if somebody is putting a conditional use permit for a coffee roaster or a laundromat or whatever machine is going to be whirring, we do have
Yes.
authority on those kinds of
do.
uses.
We already have.
So I think we're covered where it counts.
Was there anything else that came up other than construction specifically? It's been kind of a pattern of complaint.
Off the top of Chairman, Commissioner Smith, off the top of my head, in the last few years, there's nothing that I can think of specifically. Certainly, I'm sure if I really think about it, I can come up with other noise complaints that the city's received, but it really tends to be, in my opinion right now, really the construction noise we do get complaints on. But
I've heard from folks that the bullfrogs are too loud, but that's a difficult one too.
that would be very difficult to address. Thank you. I do feel that I have direction there.
I did have a question about that, sorry, Chairman. Jenna, are we just talking about like sounds that are like large scale, like construction or road, like you're talking about, or like also like sounds that like your neighbors like doing stuff loud, or like, because I know there's like concert venues around town too, but those are all addressed by like, is that the state regulation you were talking about with
Or
like
amplified sound.
times,
Yes.
like time of day, and there's a certain number of hours per day that it can't exceed. I remember reading something about it.
Chairman, Commissioner Shepherd, I will not do it justice. There's others in the room that may know this much better than I do. But there is a state statute that, in my words, not the statute's words, if somebody is being a nuisance, then the police department can address that through state statute. And yes, I believe it can be any noise. So if your neighbors are being rowdy at midnight, I think you could call the police department and still have it addressed outside of the land use ordinance through the state statute.
Okay, and in this realm, it's more like, it's not like your nuisance sounds, it's more like the other sounds that just exist in the community.
Chairman, Commissioner Shepherd, in what I've seen in land use ordinances, the city's current code having it addressed use by use or at certain uses that might have louder noises, to me makes sense instead of a blanket ordinance, unless that is going to be more in like the health safety side of code, maybe outside of the land use code. But that's my opinion, and certainly. All right. There was another a change to current code that was proposed by staff, and that's when there are taller buildings over 35 feet that could create the ability to look down, that the trees would have to be taller if there's perimeter landscaping required. And so instead of somebody planting like a class 1 tree, they plant a 35 foot, or they'd be required that the trees be 35 feet or taller. Okay.
I think that makes sense.
All right.
But if the idea is that it doesn't, take 20 years to be useful.
Right.
Maybe we need to put fast growing in there too.
With the trees, do they have like bigger roots that go down that we need to think about as far as sidewalks and roads?
Chairman, Commissioner Shepherd, I'm not a a landscape architect expert, but what I believe I know is that it depends on the tree, but typically the roots will be bigger with the taller, bigger canopy, but there are certain trees that do better, say in roads, because they do go deeper, versus other roots might want to stay higher and shallower. And so it may depend on the tree, what the tree does. So. And then Another big change, as we're talking about buffers, there's kind of a couple of big things. The design review consultant's current code does require a step back after, I don't remember how tall, I think it's 20 feet. So there's a step back it's penciled in at 10 feet. But the continuing to step back wasn't desirable in that could get really weird. And one of the comments that the consultants made is if you continue to step back, you may be detracting from privacy because people will want to start utilizing that areas as maybe balconies or outdoor areas. So they may not have windows, but then you may have a whole lot of activity adjacent to side yards. Another item that was discussed that the consultants were not in favor of is transition buffers between adjacent zones. They had indicated that property protection goes both ways for the existing residents as well as those that are redeveloping their property, and they wanted to make sure to not create a situation where they're unequally addressing certain properties that may be adjacent to one another. And that's a big point of discussion. I don't know if the commission wants to look at transition language or they agree with the consultants. I'm seeing some head shakes, so I'll move on. In table 82B1, which is discussing the different zones, sorry to jump back. The word typical is utilized currently, talking about the different housing types in the different zones. Staff is suggesting that perhaps instead of talking about typical housing types, to strike that and just talk about the different comprehensive plan designations that the zoning could implement. All right.
That's a good idea. That's good.
All right. There's another question. Currently, code has an overlay for neighborhood commercial. It's voluntary. No one has ever utilized it. And it's been on the books for, I think, I may be wrong on this, but since around 2008. And there's a question of if the overlay should be repealed.
Repealed because it's not being used?
Involuntary.
Meaning, I'm confused. An overlay, correct me if I'm wrong, is an overlay that we, the city, would implement and apply to a property or a swath of property. So when you say it's not being used, what do you mean? We've never used it.
Chairman Commissioner Wild, that's correct. No property owner has requested to develop under the regulations that are, they're not required to develop to those regulations, but they may choose to pull down a different set of regulations. And to my knowledge, no one has used it. So it may, if it's maintained, should it be required? And if so, are the requirements the correct requirements, or why hasn't anybody utilized it? Would be staff's question. But certainly,
what does our design consultant say about that question?
We did not specifically discuss that.
Sorry.
So it currently isn't hurting.
Guidance on that. I'm all for decluttering. I'm all for small government, small code, if possible. But I don't know that it hasn't been used as
okay
enough. to convince me it's not appropriate in our code.
That's good. I think those get through my big questions or the questions posed. I did want to state that there was a desire to make sure to keep an eye and that this would not detract. Anything that was done here would not detract from affordability or cause displacement. And so I just wanted to note that that is a concern as well.
So Jen, I do have on section 15, page 14, and this is regarding the mix of uses.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Yes. There's a new section that's being proposed, mix of uses. And in the mixed use districts, the consultants did note that there was a concern that the mixed use might go all residential, all commercial, depending on what they're wanting to do and how do you truly make a mixed use zoning district. And so last month, there was a couple of provisions penciled in, noting that for developments with a site of more than 120,000 gross square feet, 10% would be dedicated to dwellings if non-residential, or if there were more than 50 dwellings, then and a density of 20 units per acre or more, then 30% would need to have non-residential. And in looking at that, it's, you know, where is it, when does it become arbitrary and what's the correct number? And so to try to solve those two ideas, staff suggested that for developments that do not meet the above criteria, they can still be allowed, but they would need a conditional use permit.
That's a good fix.
I like that. It gives us an out.
Absolutely. That's a good way. It's a good way to do it.
All right. And there's one other big thing that I forgot to mention. Currently, code looks to the comprehensive plan for the activity nodes, and it dictates densities and whatnot. And so there's also been taking the language of where those are and adding it to code, so the code is within the code.
Jenna, I guess my biggest question, and maybe it's just that I'm not understanding all this fully, is like, when I think of a buffers ordinance, like a lot of this makes sense to me, but then the height restrictions and the density restrictions, they don't really make sense to me as like a buffer. So that's why I was a little like, I get thrown off maybe by all of a sudden seeing like no maximum density, no maximum height in like a certain area of town, without it being like more publicly to me, and this just might be in my mind, the word buffer wouldn't call me to a public meeting. So I don't know how other people feel like in the community, but is that what you're saying? Like, in my understanding that you're taking those words from the comprehensive plan and putting them into code, and that's
Chairman Commissioner Shepherd, no. So the marrying of the comprehensive plan with code was talking about where code talks about the activity nodes. And then this map down here is the zone or the comprehensive plan. And these circles are looked at to be higher density or facilitate transit. And so code currently says you have to have a minimum density or conditional use in these areas, or talks about these areas slightly differently. And so what staff is suggesting is define where those areas are defined in the comprehensive plan and bring it into this code and actively define it here. So you don't have to look at two documents to know where that location is. But the staff has also suggested that height could be a buffer situation. So if you are a 1-story home adjacent to a 10-story unit, you may not feel that there is an adequate buffer if there are not, based on height or setbacks. The setbacks that were proposed to change in this is mixed use. And so the current zones are the purple over at Carlton Bay, City Hall, the new Mountain View Townhomes behind Fred Meyer, and then a couple of areas in the waterfront district on the east end. Currently, there's a 10-foot maximum setback. So saying that whole building needs to be pushed up to the street. Staff is suggesting perhaps a 5-foot minimum might also be appropriate. So you don't have a looming building right on the sidewalk, right on the public right of way. And then for the most part, so then the height, the potential to add that 45-foot height restriction back in the R3 zoning district west of Glenwood. I'm trying to think if there were any other proposed changes aside from clarifications. And
So Jenna, real quick, back to that height thing, 'cause I've been thinking about it since Commissioner Wild was asking about it. Wouldn't that though, as far as the takings analysis, I mean, anybody that had already developed relying on not having it would essentially be grandfathered in, right? They're not going to suddenly be non-conforming, right? They would just be grandfathered into the previous code.
I think that's grandfathering is legal non-conforming.
Right. So,
Yes.
so it wouldn't burden, it would only burden new developments, I guess is what
Chairman Commissioner Smith, yes, unless something weird. I'm trying to think of an instance.
maybe like a tear down.
Yeah.
Build or.
If you had a fire, you couldn't build back would be a good example.
Okay. I agree with Commissioner Wild. I'm not gonna make a change until we need to make a change.
All right. And then any other feedback, anything that's missing, anything that shouldn't be in there, needs tweaked?
You did a great job. Thank you.
Yeah, really good.
Thank you
work.
all.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Anything else on this matter? All right, sounds like everybody loves it, and
Beautiful.
we'll call the meeting adjourned. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.